The conference room at Naval Base Norfolk fell silent as General Sarah Martinez walked through the doors. Every officer in the room knew her reputation. At 42, she was the youngest woman ever to reach the rank of Brigadier General in the Marine Corps. Her combat boots echoed against the polished floor as she made her way to the front of the room, where a panel of Navy admirals and Marine Corps generals waited. Sarah had seen this room many times before, but today felt different. Today, she was here to discuss the future of joint military operations between the Navy and Marine Corps. The meeting had been called to address concerns about the effectiveness of recent overseas missions and the growing tensions in various global hotspots. Admiral Robert Chun, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and sharp blue eyes, sat at the center of the panel. He had requested this meeting specifically to hear from field commanders who had recent combat experience. Sarah's record spoke for itself. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and most recently, a classified operation in Eastern Europe that had saved countless civilian lives. As Sarah took her seat at the witness table, she could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. There were 27 officers present, and she was one of only 3 women. This wasn't unusual for her. She had spent her entire career being the only woman, or one of very few, in nearly every room she entered. The meeting began with standard protocols. Admiral Chun outlined the purpose of the gathering and introduced each panel member. Sarah listened carefully, taking mental notes of each officer's background and potential biases. She had learned long ago that understanding her audience was crucial to effective communication. General Martinez. Admiral Chun began, his voice carrying the authority of decades in service. Your recent operations have been highly successful by all standard metrics. However, we've received some concerning reports about the methods used to achieve these results. Sarah straightened in her chair. She had expected this line of questioning. Military success often came with difficult decisions, and she had never shied away from making the hard choices when lives were on the line. What specific concerns do you have, Admiral? Sarah asked, her voice steady and professional. Admiral Chun shuffled through a stack of papers in front of him. There are reports that suggest your units have been involved in an unusually high number of direct combat engagements. Some of our analysts are wondering if there might be more diplomatic solutions to these situations. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could feel the tension building in the room. She knew that some officers questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, despite the fact that the ban on women in combat positions had been lifted years earlier. She had faced this skepticism throughout her career, and she had always responded with professionalism and results. Admiral, Sarah replied, every engagement my units have been involved in was necessary to protect innocent civilians and accomplish our mission objectives. I don't take the decision to engage lightly, but I won't hesitate to do what's necessary to save lives. Colonel James Morrison, a Marine Corps officer sitting to Admiral Chun's left, leaned forward. Sarah knew Morrison by reputation. He was old school, traditional, and had been vocal about his concerns regarding women in combat roles. General Martinez. Morrison said, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, we've all read your after-action reports. They make for interesting reading. Tell us, how many enemy combatants would you estimate your units have neutralized across all your deployments? The question was clearly intended to put Sarah on the defensive. Morrison was asking about her kill count, a crude way of measuring military effectiveness that reduced the complex realities of combat to simple numbers. It was the kind of question that male officers might ask each other in informal settings, but it felt different when directed at a woman in a formal military hearing. Sarah felt the room's energy shift. Every officer was now watching her carefully, waiting to see how she would respond. Some seemed curious. Others appeared uncomfortable with the directness of the question. She could sense that this moment would be remembered and discussed long after the meeting ended. The silence stretched for several seconds. Sarah had faced enemy fire, made life and death decisions under extreme pressure, and led Marines through some of the most dangerous operations of the past decade. But, sitting in this sterile conference room, facing the judgment of her peers, she felt a different kind of pressure. She thought about the men and women who had served under her command. She remembered Private Johnson, barely 19, who had been killed by an improvised explosive device during her second tour in Afghanistan. She remembered Sergeant Williams, a mother of two, who had been wounded while providing medical aid to civilians caught in crossfire. She remembered the faces of the children they had evacuated from a bomb school in Iraq. Each number that Morrison was asking about represented a life, sometimes the life of someone who had been trying to harm innocent people, but a life nonetheless. Sarah had never taken killing lightly, even when it was necessary. Every death weighed on her, kept her awake some nights, and reminded her of the true cost of military service. "Colonel Morrison," Sarah finally said, her voice calm but firm, "I don't keep a tally of enemy casualties like they're trophies on a wall. Every engagement my units have been involved in was thoroughly documented and investigated through proper channels. If you have specific questions about any particular operation, I'm happy to provide detailed explanations." Morrison's smirk widened. "Come now, General. You've been in combat for over 15 years. Surely you have some idea of the numbers we're talking about. It's a simple question. How many enemy combatants have you personally eliminated?" The word personally hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah realized that Morrison wasn't just asking about her unit's effectiveness. He was specifically asking about her own direct involvement in combat. This was a more personal attack, designed to question whether she had the stomach for the realities of war. Admiral Chen seemed to sense that the questioning was taking an inappropriate turn. "Colonel Morrison, I'm not sure that specific numbers are relevant to our discussion of operational effectiveness." But Morrison pressed on. "I think it's very relevant, Admiral. We're discussing the future of joint operations, and we need commanders who understand the realities of combat. General Martinez has built quite a reputation as an effective combat leader. I'm simply asking her to quantify that effectiveness." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. She had spent years proving herself in a male-dominated profession, and she had always done so through professionalism and competence. But Morrison's line of questioning felt designed to reduce her service to a crude statistic, as if her worth as an officer could be measured by how many people she had killed. The room was completely silent now. Every officer was waiting to see how this confrontation would play out. Sarah could see sympathy in some faces, curiosity in others, and what looked like approval of Morrison's aggressive questioning in a few. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career. Instead of deflecting or refusing to answer, she would respond with complete honesty. But her answer wouldn't be what anyone in the room expected. "You want to know about kill counts, Colonel?" Sarah said, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "You want to reduce 15 years of service, 3 Purple Hearts, and dozens of successful missions to a simple number?" Morrison nodded, clearly thinking he was about to score a significant point in whatever game he thought they were playing. "Fine," Sarah continued, standing up from her chair. "Let me tell you about numbers, Colonel Morrison. Let me tell you about the numbers that actually matter." Every person in the room leaned forward. This was clearly not going where anyone had expected it to go. "In my 15 years of service," Sarah began, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank and experience, "my units have evacuated 2,847 civilians from combat zones. We've provided medical aid to 1,205 wounded noncombatants. We've delivered food and water to 15,000 people in refugee camps. We've cleared 127 miles of roads of improvised explosive devices, making them safe for civilian traffic." She paused, letting these numbers sink in before continuing. "We've trained 89 local police officers in 3 different countries, helping them maintain security after we left. We've built 12 schools, 6 medical clinics, and 1 orphanage. We've reunited 34 children with their families after they were separated during combat operations." The room was completely silent. These weren't the numbers Morrison had been asking for, but they were painting a picture of military service that went far beyond simple combat statistics. "But you want to know about enemy combatants," Sarah continued, her voice steady but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. You know about the people we've killed in the line of duty. Morrison nodded again, but his smirk had disappeared. He was beginning to realize that he had opened a door he might not be prepared to walk through. I've been directly involved in engagements that resulted in the deaths of enemy combatants, Sarah said. But I don't keep count because each one of those deaths represents a failure of diplomacy, a failure of intelligence, a failure to find a peaceful solution to a violent problem. She walked around the table, moving closer to the panel of officers. Every time I've had to take a life, it was because someone was actively trying to harm innocent people or the Marines under my command. Every single time, I tried everything else first. And every single time, I've had to live with the knowledge that someone's son, brother, or father died because I couldn't find a better way. The emotion in her voice was unmistakable now. This wasn't the cold, professional response that Morrison had been expecting. This was something much more human and much more powerful. So no, Colonel Morrison, I don't have a kill count that I'm proud of. What I have is a list of people I saved, missions I completed successfully, and Marines who came home alive because of decisions I made under fire. Admiral Chun was watching this exchange with what appeared to be growing respect. Several other officers in the room were nodding slightly, clearly moved by Sarah's response. But Sarah wasn't finished. If you want to judge my effectiveness as a military officer based on how many people I've killed, then you're missing the point of what we do, she continued. We don't serve to kill people. We serve to protect people. Sometimes that requires violence, but violence is never the goal. She returned to her position behind the witness table, but remained standing. I've served with some of the finest Marines in the Corps. I've seen 19-year-old kids show more courage and wisdom than some people develop in a lifetime. I've seen soldiers risk their lives to save people they'd never met and would never see again. And not one of them ever bragged about their kill count. Morrison was now looking decidedly uncomfortable. What had started as an attempt to embarrass or discredit Sarah had backfired spectacularly. The question you should be asking, Sarah said, looking directly at Morrison, is not how many people I've killed, but how many people are alive today because of the work my Marines and I have done. That's the number that matters. That's the number that defines what we do. Admiral Chun cleared his throat. General Martinez, thank you for that perspective. I think it provides important context for our discussion. But Sarah could see that Morrison wasn't ready to let this go. He had invested too much in this line of questioning to simply back down now. That's all very touching, General, Morrison said, his voice carrying a slight sneer. But the reality is that we're fighting an enemy that doesn't share your humanitarian concerns. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is eliminate threats quickly and efficiently. Sarah felt a flash of anger. Morrison was now questioning not just her methods, but her commitment to the mission and the safety of her troops. Colonel, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level, are you suggesting that I've somehow failed to eliminate threats to my Marines or to civilian populations? Morrison seemed to sense that he was walking into dangerous territory, but he pressed ahead anyway. I'm simply saying that sometimes hesitation in combat can cost American lives. The accusation was clear. Morrison was suggesting that Sarah's humanitarian concerns might have compromised her ability to make hard decisions in combat. It was an accusation that struck at the heart of her professional competence and her fitness for command. Every officer in the room now understood that this had moved beyond a simple discussion of operational tactics. This was now a direct challenge to Sarah's qualifications and her record of service. Sarah looked around the room, seeing a mixture of expressions on the faces of her fellow officers. Some looked uncomfortable with Morrison's aggressive questioning. Others seemed curious to see how she would respond to this more direct challenge. Admiral Chun was frowning, clearly unhappy with the direction the discussion had taken. He seemed to be weighing whether to intervene or allow Sarah to respond. Sarah made the decision for him. Colonel Morrison, she said, her voice now carrying the full authority of her rank and experience. I want to make sure I understand your question correctly. Are you suggesting that I have hesitated to take necessary action when American lives were at stake? Morrison paused, perhaps realizing that he was now committed to a course of action that could have serious consequences for both of them. I'm simply asking whether your focus on humanitarian concerns has ever prevented you from taking decisive action when such action was needed, he replied. Sarah nodded slowly. I see. You want to know if I'm too soft for combat command. The directness of her statement caught Morrison off guard. He had been trying to make his point through implication and suggestion. Sarah had just brought the subtext of his questions into the open. That's not what I said, Morrison replied, but his discomfort was obvious. But it's what you meant, Sarah said. Let me answer that question for you, Colonel Morrison. And let me answer it in a way that might help you understand what real combat leadership looks like. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through to a photo. Then she walked over to the projection screen at the front of the room and connected her device. The image that appeared on the screen was of Sarah in full combat gear, standing next to a young Afghan girl who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Both were covered in dust, and Sarah's uniform showed clear signs of recent combat. This photo was taken 3 years ago in Helmand province, Sarah said, her voice softer now, but still carrying complete authority. We had just finished a 6-hour firefight with Taliban forces who had taken control of a small village. They were using the village school as a base of operations, and they had taken several children hostage. She clicked to the next photo, which showed the aftermath of what had clearly been an intense battle. Buildings were damaged, and there was evidence of explosive devices and small arms fire. The Taliban fighters were well-armed and well-positioned. They had clear fields of fire and superior defensive positions. A traditional assault would have resulted in heavy casualties among my Marines and almost certain death for the hostages. She clicked to another photo, this one showing a detailed tactical map with markings indicating troop movements and strategic positions. Instead of ordering a direct assault, we spent 4 hours developing a plan that would allow us to neutralize the threat while minimizing risk to both my Marines and the civilian hostages. It required precise coordination, perfect timing, and yes, it required killing enemy combatants who refused to surrender. Morrison was listening intently now, and the smirk had completely disappeared from his face. The operation was successful, Sarah continued. We eliminated 12 Taliban fighters, rescued 7 children, and suffered 0 casualties among my Marines. But here's the part that your question misses entirely, Colonel Morrison. She clicked to the final photo, which showed several of the rescued children being reunited with their families. The success of that operation wasn't measured by how many people we killed. It was measured by how many people we saved. And the reason we were able to save them was because we took the time to plan carefully, to consider all options, and to execute with precision rather than just applying maximum force. Sarah disconnected her phone and returned to the witness table. You asked about hesitation, Colonel Morrison. What you call hesitation, I call tactical thinking. What you call humanitarian concerns, I call mission focus. And what you call decisive action, I call doing the job, right, instead of just doing it fast. Admiral Chun was now looking at Morrison with obvious disapproval. Several other officers were nodding in agreement with Sarah's explanation. But Sarah wasn't finished making her point. I want to address your underlying question directly, she said, looking Morrison straight in the eye. You want to know if I'm tough enough for combat command. You want to know if I can make the hard decisions when American lives are at stake. She paused, letting the tension build before continuing. Let me tell you about the hardest decision I've ever had to make as a combat commander. The conference room remained silent as Sarah prepared to share what she had never spoken about in any official report. Admiral Chun leaned forward, sensing that they were about to hear something significant. Even Colonel Morrison had stopped his aggressive questioning, waiting to hear what Sarah considered her hardest decision. 2 years ago, during Operation Mountain Shield in Eastern Europe, my unit was tasked with evacuating a civilian population from a small town that had become a battlefield between government forces and rebel fighters, Sarah began, her voice taking on a more serious tone. She moved away from the witness table and stood facing the panel directly, her military bearing evident in every movement. The town of Moravica had a population of about 3,000 people, mostly elderly residents and families with young children who hadn't been able to evacuate earlier. The fighting had intensified rapidly, and both sides were using increasingly heavy weapons. Civilian casualties were mounting by the hour. Sarah paused, and for the first time since the meeting began, her professional composure showed a crack. The memory she was about to share was clearly painful. We arrived at 0600 hours with a convoy of 12 vehicles and 150 Marines. Our orders were simple: get the civilians out safely and avoid engagement with either side unless absolutely necessary. This was supposed to be a humanitarian mission, not a combat operation. Admiral Chen interrupted gently. General Martinez, if this involves classified operational details, you don't need to know. Admiral, Sarah cut him off. This story needs to be told, and it directly addresses Colonel Morrison's questions about combat effectiveness and decision-making under pressure. She continued, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of what she was sharing. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly for the first 3 hours. We had loaded approximately 1,200 civilians into our vehicles and were making regular runs to a safe zone about 15 kilometers away. My Marines were performing exactly as trained, professional, efficient, compassionate with the civilians, and maintaining strict discipline under challenging conditions. Sarah walked to the projection screen and pulled up a new image, a satellite photo of a small town surrounded by mountainous terrain. At 0945 hours, everything changed. A rebel unit, approximately 80 fighters with heavy weapons, had taken positions on the high ground overlooking the main evacuation route. They weren't just blocking our path. They were actively engaging both government forces and any vehicle that tried to use the road. She pointed to specific locations on the satellite image as she spoke. We had two choices: attempt to negotiate passage with the rebels, which would take hours we didn't have, or find an alternative route through much more dangerous terrain. Either option would significantly delay the evacuation and put both civilians and Marines at increased risk. Colonel Morrison, despite his earlier antagonistic approach, was now listening with genuine interest. This was clearly a complex tactical situation with no easy answers. While we were assessing our options, Sarah continued, we received intelligence that changed everything. Government forces were planning an artillery strike on the town in exactly 4 hours. They considered the civilian population acceptable losses in their effort to root out the rebel fighters. The room was completely silent. Every officer present understood the impossible situation Sarah was describing. So now we had 1,800 civilians still in the town, a rebel force blocking our primary evacuation route, and a countdown clock that ended with artillery fire on our exact position. And we had to make decisions that would determine who lived and who died. Sarah returned to the witness table, but remained standing, her hands clasped behind her back in a classic military stance. This is where your question about kill counts becomes relevant, Colonel Morrison, because the decision I had to make was about exactly that. How many people would die based on the choices I made in the next few minutes? Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair, beginning to understand that his earlier questioning was about to be turned back on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. I had 3 tactical options, Sarah said, holding up 3 fingers as she enumerated them. First, attempt to negotiate with the rebels, knowing that we probably wouldn't reach an agreement before the artillery strike began. This option would likely result in the deaths of all 1,800 remaining civilians, plus my 150 Marines. She lowered 1 finger. Second, attempt to force our way through the rebel position using overwhelming firepower. This would almost certainly result in heavy casualties among both the rebels and my Marines, but it might allow some civilians to escape before the artillery strike. She lowered another finger. Third, coordinate with government forces to delay their artillery strike, while we engaged the rebel position in a way that would clear the evacuation route without unnecessary casualties. Sarah paused, letting the complexity of the situation sink in. Each option involved killing people. Each option involved accepting that some people would die so that others could live. The question wasn't whether people would die. That was already determined. The question was how many and who, and whether their deaths would serve any meaningful purpose. Admiral Chun was taking notes, clearly recognizing that this was a case study in combat leadership that would be valuable for training future officers. "I chose a fourth option," Sarah said, surprising everyone in the room. "A fourth option?" Morrison asked, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "I split my force," Sarah explained. 50 Marines stayed behind to continue the evacuation using the dangerous mountain route. 100 Marines came with me to neutralize the rebel position, not through overwhelming force, but through precision and speed. She moved back to the projection screen and brought up a tactical diagram. We identified the rebel command structure through surveillance and intercepted communications. Instead of engaging their entire force, we targeted their leadership and communications equipment. 12 well-placed shots from our snipers eliminated their command structure. 2 precision strikes with shoulder-fired rockets destroyed their heavy weapons. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes. Sarah pointed to specific locations on the tactical diagram as she explained the operation. When the rebel fighters realized they had lost their command structure and their heavy weapons, most of them retreated. We didn't pursue them. We didn't continue the engagement. We opened the evacuation route and got our people out. The room was silent as everyone absorbed this information. The result was that we evacuated all 1,800 civilians with 0 civilian casualties. We lost 2 Marines in the operation, Corporal Jennifer Walsh and Sergeant Michael Chun, both killed by sniper fire during the assault on the rebel position. 14 rebels were killed in the engagement. Sarah's voice caught slightly as she mentioned the fallen Marines, and it was clear that these losses still weighed heavily on her. "But here's the point that addresses your question, Colonel Morrison," she said, looking directly at him. "The success of that operation wasn't measured by how many rebels we killed. It was measured by how many civilians we saved and how many Marines made it home." She walked back toward the panel of officers, her combat boots clicking sharply on the polished floor. "You asked about kill counts. You want to know if I was too soft for combat command. Let me answer that question with a question of my own. Do you think I should have killed more people that day?" Morrison was clearly uncomfortable now. That's not what I was suggesting. Isn't it?" Sarah challenged. "You wanted to know how many enemy combatants I've eliminated, as if that number somehow measures my effectiveness as an officer. You suggested that humanitarian concerns might make me hesitate in combat. What exactly were you measuring?" She didn't wait for Morrison to answer. "Because if we're measuring effectiveness by civilian lives saved, that operation was an unqualified success. If we're measuring effectiveness by mission completion, we achieved 100% of our objectives. If we're measuring effectiveness by Marine casualties, we minimized losses while accomplishing an extremely dangerous mission." Sarah's voice was rising slightly, but her tone remained professional. "But if we're measuring effectiveness by how many people I killed, then maybe I failed. Maybe I should have ordered a full assault that would have killed 80 rebels instead of just 14. Maybe I should have called for airstrikes that would have leveled the entire rebel position. Maybe I should have chosen maximum violence instead of precision." The sarcasm in her voice was unmistakable, and Morrison was beginning to look like he regretted starting this line of questioning. "Tell me, Colonel Morrison," Sarah continued, "in your experience, what's the appropriate number of enemy casualties for a successful mission? Because I'd really like to know what metric you're using to evaluate my combat performance." Admiral Chun decided it was time to intervene. "General Martinez, I think you've made your point very clearly. Colonel Morrison, I believe we can move on to other aspects of General Martinez's service record." But Sarah wasn't ready to let this go. She had spent too many years dealing with subtle and not-so-subtle questions about her fitness for combat command, and Morrison had given her an opportunity to address these concerns directly. "Actually, Admiral, I'd like to continue this discussion," she said, "because I think it highlights a fundamental misunderstanding about what combat leadership actually involves." She turned to address the entire panel, not just Morrison. "Every officer in this room has been trained to make life and death decisions. We've all studied tactics, strategy, and military history. We've all learned about the principles of war and the importance of decisive action. But how many of you have actually had to look through a rifle scope at another human being and make the decision to end their life?" Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. It was clear that Sarah was asking a question that many of them couldn't answer from personal experience. "I have," Sarah said simply, "multiple times. And each time, it was the hardest decision I've ever had to make. Not because I was afraid, not because I was hesitant, but because I understood the weight of that decision." She moved closer to the panel, making eye contact with each officer as she spoke. "When you kill someone in combat, you're not just eliminating an enemy combatant. You're ending someone's son's life. You're making someone's mother grieve. You're changing the world in a way that can never be undone. And if you don't feel the weight of that responsibility, then you shouldn't be in a position where you have to make those decisions." Admiral Chun was nodding slightly, clearly moved by Sarah's words. "But," Sarah continued, "when you're responsible for the lives of the Marines under your command, and when innocent civilians are depending on you for protection, then you make whatever decisions are necessary. You do whatever has to be done, and you live with the consequences for the rest of your life." She returned to her position behind the witness table and, finally, sat down. "So to answer your original question, Colonel Morrison, no, I don't have a kill count that I'm proud of. What I have is a record of successful missions, Marines who came home alive, and civilians who were saved from situations they should never have been in." Morrison was quiet for several moments before responding. When he did speak, his tone was much more respectful than it had been earlier. "General Martinez, I want to clarify that I wasn't questioning your courage or your commitment to the mission. I was trying to understand your tactical decision-making process." Sarah looked at him steadily. "And what have you concluded about my tactical decision-making process?" Morrison paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. I think I may have been asking the wrong questions." It was as close to an apology as anyone was likely to get from Morrison, and Sarah decided to accept it gracefully. "Colonel, we're all trying to understand how to be more effective at protecting American lives and achieving our mission objectives. Sometimes that means asking difficult questions. I appreciate your willingness to engage in this discussion." Admiral Chun looked relieved that the tension in the room was beginning to ease. "General Martinez, your perspective on combat leadership is clearly informed by extensive field experience. Can you share some thoughts on how we might better prepare future officers for the kinds of decisions you've had to make?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Admiral, I think one of the most important things we can teach future officers is that every decision in combat has moral dimensions as well as tactical ones. We need leaders who can think clearly under pressure, who can adapt to changing situations, and who understand that the goal is always to accomplish the mission with minimum casualties on all sides." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "We also need to prepare officers for the psychological reality of combat command. Taking responsibility for life and death decisions is emotionally demanding in ways that training can't fully prepare you for. We need to ensure that our officers have the support they need to process these experiences and continue to serve effectively." General Patricia Williams, who had been silent throughout the meeting, spoke for the first time. "General Martinez, how do you maintain your effectiveness as a commander while dealing with the emotional weight of these decisions?" It was a question that got to the heart of military leadership: how to remain functional and decisive while carrying the psychological burden of command decisions. "General Williams, that's an excellent question," Sarah replied. "I think the key is finding ways to honor the weight of these decisions without becoming paralyzed by them." She stood up again, seeming to need the movement to express her thoughts clearly. After every engagement, I write detailed after-action reports that include not just tactical analysis, but personal reflection on the decisions made and their consequences. This helps me process the experience and identify lessons for future situations. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the naval base, where hundreds of service members were going about their daily duties. I also make it a point to visit the families of every Marine killed or wounded under my command. Not because military protocol requires it, but because I need to look into the eyes of the people who paid the price for my decisions. It keeps me grounded and reminds me why precision and careful planning matters so much. She turned back to face the panel. But most importantly, I never make these decisions alone. I surround myself with experienced NCOs and officers who aren't afraid to tell me when they think I'm wrong. Good combat leadership isn't about being the toughest person in the room. It's about making the best possible decisions with the information available. Admiral Chun was taking detailed notes, clearly finding value in Sarah's responses. General Martinez, he said, "You mentioned that you write personal reflections after combat engagements. Can you share some insights from those reflections that might help other officers?" Sarah returned to her seat, considering how much personal information she was willing to share in this formal setting. "One of the most important lessons I've learned," she said, "is that the enemy is usually someone who believes they're fighting for something important. That doesn't mean we can't or shouldn't engage them when necessary, but understanding their motivations often provides tactical advantages." She leaned forward, her voice becoming more intense. "For example, in the Operation Mountain Shield situation I described earlier, we discovered through intelligence that the rebel commander had lost his own family in a government artillery strike 6 months earlier. This helped us understand why he had chosen that particular position. He was trying to prevent the same thing from happening to the civilians in the town." Morrison was listening intently now, clearly engaged despite their earlier conflict. Understanding this allowed us to approach the engagement differently. Instead of viewing the rebels as simply an obstacle to our mission, we recognized that they had legitimate concerns about civilian casualties. This intelligence influenced our tactical plan and ultimately contributed to the successful outcome. Admiral Chun looked up from his notes. "Are you suggesting that empathy is a tactical advantage in combat situations?" Sarah smiled for the first time since the meeting began. "Admiral, I'm suggesting that understanding your enemy is always a tactical advantage. Whether you call that empathy or intelligence analysis doesn't matter. What matters is that it works." She gestured toward the panel of officers. "Every person in this room has studied military history. We've read about great commanders who achieved victory through superior understanding of their opponents. Sun Tzu, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, they all emphasize the importance of knowing your enemy." Sarah stood up again, her energy building as she warmed to this topic. "But somewhere along the way, we've started to think that understanding the enemy means sympathizing with them, or that recognizing their humanity makes us weak. That's not true. In fact, it's the opposite." She moved to the front of the room, facing the entire panel. "The most effective combat commanders I've served with have all had one thing in common. They understood that their enemies were human beings with motivations, fears, and tactical weaknesses that could be exploited." General Williams leaned forward with interest. "Can you give us a specific example of how this understanding translated into tactical advantage?" Sarah nodded. "During my second tour in Afghanistan, we were dealing with an IED network that had killed several Marines and wounded dozens more. Traditional counter-IED operations weren't working. We'd clear a road, and within 24 hours, new devices would appear." She moved back to the projection screen and brought up a map of Afghanistan. "Instead of just continuing to play defense, we started studying the people who were planting these devices. We learned that most of them were local farmers who were being paid by Taliban recruiters. The money they received for planting IEDs was often the difference between their families eating or going hungry." Sarah pointed to specific areas on the map as she spoke. "Once we understood this, we were able to develop a different approach. Instead of just hunting for IED emplacers, we started working with local leaders to create alternative income opportunities. We hired local men to help with road maintenance, infrastructure projects, and security patrols. Morrison was taking notes now, clearly interested in the tactical implications. The result was that IED incidents in our area of operations decreased by 75% over the next 6 months. Not because we killed more enemy fighters, but because we eliminated their recruitment pool. Admiral Chun looked up from his notes. That's an impressive result. Was this approach replicated in other areas? Sarah's expression darkened slightly. We tried to share these lessons with other units, but the response was mixed. Some commanders embraced the approach and achieved similar results. Others felt that it was too complicated, too time-consuming, or too soft for a combat environment. The word soft hung in the air, and everyone in the room understood the reference to Morrison's earlier questioning. I want to be clear, Sarah continued. This approach required just as much courage and tactical skill as traditional combat operations. The Marines implementing these programs were constantly at risk, and we still had to conduct combat operations when necessary. She paused, making eye contact with Morrison. But it was more effective at achieving our strategic objectives than simply trying to kill our way to victory. The silence in the conference room stretched longer than before. Admiral Chun was reviewing his notes, clearly processing everything he had heard. Several officers were exchanging glances, and the dynamics in the room had shifted dramatically since the meeting began. Colonel Morrison cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention back to the panel. When he spoke, his tone was markedly different from his earlier aggressive questioning. General Martinez, Morrison began, I want to revisit my earlier questions, but from a different angle. You shared some remarkable examples of tactical innovation and successful mission outcomes. But I'm curious about the failures. Every combat commander has situations that didn't go according to plan. Can you share an example of a time when your approach didn't work? The question was more respectful than his earlier challenges, but Sarah could see that Morrison was still probing, still trying to understand her command philosophy and its limitations. Sarah considered the question carefully. Admitting failure in a room full of senior officers was risky, but she had already committed to complete honesty in this discussion. That's a fair question, Colonel, she said. And you're right. Every combat commander has situations that they would handle differently in retrospect. She moved away from the witness table and began pacing slowly, a habit she had developed when dealing with difficult topics. About 18 months ago, during Operation Silver Dawn in North Africa, we were tasked with rescuing a group of aid workers who had been kidnapped by a militant organization. Intelligence suggested they were being held in a compound about 200 kilometers from our forward operating base. Sarah paused at the window, looking out at the naval base as she gathered her thoughts. The situation was complicated by several factors. First, the kidnappers had made public demands for the release of prisoners and withdrawal of international forces from the region. Second, they had threatened to kill the hostages if any rescue attempt was made. Third, the compound was located in a densely populated civilian area. She turned back to face the panel, her expression serious. Using the approach I described earlier, we spent considerable time gathering intelligence about the kidnappers' motivations, their organizational structure, and their relationship with the local population. We discovered that the group's leader had lost his brother in a drone strike 6 months earlier, and that several of the other members had similar grievances against international military presence. Admiral Chun looked up from his notes. Were you able to establish communication with the kidnappers? We were, Sarah replied. Through local intermediaries, we initiated negotiations while simultaneously planning for multiple contingencies. The negotiations continued for 4 days, during which we made some progress on understanding their demands and concerns. Sarah's voice became more tense as she continued. However, on the 4th day, we received intelligence that the kidnappers were planning to move the hostages to a different location, one that would make a rescue operation virtually impossible. We had to make a decision, continue negotiations, and risk losing the opportunity for rescue, or launch the operation immediately. She returned to her position behind the witness table, but remained standing. Based on the intelligence we had gathered and the relationships we had built with local contacts, I believed we could conduct a rescue operation with minimal casualties on all sides. We had identified the exact location of the hostages, mapped the compound's layout, and developed a plan that would neutralize the kidnappers' leadership while avoiding harm to civilians in the surrounding area. Morrison leaned forward with interest. What went wrong? Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Our intelligence was incorrect. The kidnappers had anticipated a rescue attempt and had moved the hostages to a different building within the compound. When my Marines breached what we thought was the hostage location, they found an empty room and 3 kidnappers who were clearly waiting for them. The room was completely silent as everyone waited for Sarah to continue. The firefight that followed lasted 27 minutes. We ultimately secured the compound and rescued all 6 hostages, but the cost was higher than it should have been. 3 Marines were wounded, 7 kidnappers were killed, and 2 civilians in adjacent buildings were injured when the fighting spilled outside the compound walls. Sarah sat down for the first time in several minutes, the weight of the memory clearly affecting her. All 6 hostages survived and were returned safely to their families. From an operational standpoint, the mission was successful, but from my perspective as a commander, it was a failure because people were hurt who didn't need to be. General Williams spoke up. General Martinez, what would you have done differently? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. In retrospect, I think I allowed my confidence in the intelligence-gathering approach to override my tactical judgment. We had developed good information about the kidnappers' motivations and organizational structure, but we hadn't adequately verified the physical intelligence about the hostages' location. She leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. I should have insisted on real-time visual confirmation of the hostages' location before launching the operation. I should have planned for the possibility that our intelligence was wrong. And I should have had better contingency plans for protecting civilians in the surrounding area. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. Do you think the time spent on understanding the kidnappers' motivations was wasted effort? It was a pointed question, clearly designed to test whether Sarah's commitment to her approach had been shaken by this failure. No, Sarah replied immediately. The intelligence we gathered about the kidnappers' motivations was crucial to developing our tactical plan. It helped us understand why they had chosen that particular location, how they were likely to react under pressure, and what their decision-making process would be during the rescue operation. She stood up again, her conviction clear in her voice. The problem wasn't that we tried to understand our opponents. The problem was that we didn't verify our tactical intelligence thoroughly enough. Those are 2 completely different issues. Admiral Chun was taking notes again. What lessons did you take from this experience? Sarah walked to the projection screen and brought up a new diagram, this one showing a detailed operational planning process. We completely revised our intelligence verification procedures, she said. Now, every piece of tactical intelligence must be confirmed through at least 2 independent sources before it's used for operational planning. We also developed new protocols for real-time intelligence gathering during dynamic operations. She pointed to specific elements of the diagram as she explained. More importantly, we implemented new training procedures that emphasize the difference between strategic intelligence and tactical intelligence. Understanding your enemy's motivations is crucial for strategic planning, but it doesn't replace the need for precise, real-time information about their positions and capabilities. Morrison was studying the diagram with clear interest. Have you had opportunities to test these new procedures in combat? Sarah nodded. 3 times since then. Each operation has been more successful than the previous one. The combination of strategic understanding and precise tactical intelligence has proven to be extremely effective. She disconnected her phone from the projection system and returned to face the panel. But I want to emphasize that failure taught me something important about leadership. The goal isn't to never make mistakes. The goal is to learn from mistakes and ensure they don't happen again. Admiral Chun looked up from his notes. General Martinez, How do you balance the need for quick decision-making in combat with the thorough intelligence gathering you described? It was an excellent question that got to the heart of combat command challenges. Admiral, that's one of the most difficult aspects of combat leadership, Sarah replied. You never have as much time or information as you'd like, but you have to make decisions anyway. She moved to the front of the room, addressing the entire panel. The key is developing systems and procedures that allow you to gather and process information quickly without sacrificing quality. We've trained our intelligence teams to focus on the most critical information first: location and numbers of enemy forces, immediate threats to friendly forces, and civilian presence in the area of operations. Sarah gestured toward the officers as she continued. Once we have that baseline information, we can make tactical decisions while continuing to gather strategic intelligence in the background. The goal is to make informed decisions, not perfect decisions. General Williams leaned forward. Can you give us a specific example of how this works in practice? Sarah nodded. During our most recent operation, we received intelligence about a terrorist cell planning an attack on a refugee camp. We had approximately 6 hours to plan and execute a response before the attack was scheduled to begin. She moved back to the witness table and pulled out her phone again, bringing up another tactical diagram on the projection screen. In the first hour, we focused on gathering essential tactical information: exact location of the terrorist cell, number of operatives, weapons, and equipment available to them, and layout of the target area. This gave us enough information to begin planning a basic response. Sarah pointed to specific elements on the diagram. During the second hour, while our tactical teams were preparing for the operation, our intelligence team continued gathering strategic information: motivations of the terrorist cell, their connections to other organizations, and their likely response patterns under different scenarios. Morrison was following the explanation closely. How did the strategic intelligence affect your tactical plan? It allowed us to refine our approach significantly, Sarah replied. We learned that the terrorist cell was motivated primarily by revenge against a specific ethnic group in the refugee camp, rather than by broader ideological concerns. This helped us understand that they would fight to the death rather than surrender, which influenced our rules of engagement and tactical approach. She clicked to the next slide, showing the actual operational timeline. The operation lasted 43 minutes. We neutralized all 7 members of the terrorist cell, prevented the attack on the refugee camp, and suffered no casualties among our Marines. The combination of rapid tactical planning and strategic understanding allowed us to achieve complete success. Admiral Chun was nodding with approval. That's an impressive example of adaptive planning under time pressure. Sarah returned to her seat, but her energy remained high as she continued to engage with the panel's questions. Admiral, I think the key lesson is that good intelligence gathering and quick decision-making aren't mutually exclusive. With proper training and procedures, you could do both simultaneously. Colonel Morrison had been quiet for several minutes, clearly processing everything he had heard. When he spoke again, his tone was thoughtful rather than challenging. General Martinez, I want to return to something you said earlier about understanding the enemy. You mentioned that recognizing their humanity is a tactical advantage. Can you explain how that understanding translates into specific tactical benefits? Sarah appreciated that Morrison was engaging with her ideas seriously rather than simply trying to challenge them. Absolutely, Colonel, she replied. When you understand that your enemy is motivated by human emotions, fear, anger, loyalty, desperation, you can predict their behavior more accurately. She stood up and moved closer to the panel, her enthusiasm for the topic evident. For example, if you know that an enemy commander is primarily motivated by protecting his family, you can anticipate that he'll be more likely to surrender if you can demonstrate that continued fighting puts his family at greater risk. Conversely, if you know that he's motivated by revenge for a personal loss, you can anticipate that he'll fight more desperately and plan accordingly. Morrison was taking notes, clearly interested in the practical applications. This kind of understanding also helps you identify opportunities for nonviolent resolution, Sarah continued. If you understand what your enemy really wants, you can sometimes find ways to give them part of what they want without compromising your own mission objectives. General Williams interrupted with a question. Can you give us an example of a nonviolent resolution that you achieved through this approach? Sarah smiled slightly, pleased to share a success story that didn't involve casualties. About 8 months ago, we were dealing with a group of former military officers who had taken control of a government building in protest of pension cuts. They had weapons, explosives, and were threatening to detonate the building if their demands weren't met. She moved back to the projection screen and brought up a photo of the government building in question. Traditional negotiation approaches weren't working because the protesters didn't trust government representatives. They viewed any official communication as lies or manipulation. Sarah pointed to the building on the screen. However, our intelligence gathering revealed that the protest leader was a decorated veteran who had served with honor for 23 years before being forced into retirement due to budget cuts. His primary motivation wasn't money. It was respect and recognition for his service. Morrison leaned forward with interest. How did you use that information? Instead of sending government negotiators, we arranged for the protest leader to speak directly with other veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers, Sarah replied. We also invited representatives from veteran support organizations to participate in the discussions. She clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of the negotiation process. The key breakthrough came when we arranged for the protest leader to meet with a group of young Marines who were preparing to leave the service. They wanted to hear his advice about transitioning to civilian life, and this gave him the respect and recognition he was really looking for. Sarah's voice became more animated as she described the resolution. Once he felt that his experience and sacrifice were being acknowledged and valued, he became much more open to finding a peaceful resolution. The protest ended after 6 days with no violence, no arrests, and a commitment from the government to review the pension policies. Admiral Chun was smiling slightly, clearly impressed with the creative solution. That's an excellent example of strategic thinking, he said. How did you identify the protest leader's real motivations? Sarah returned to her seat, her satisfaction with the outcome evident. We studied his military record, interviewed his former colleagues, and analyzed his public statements over the previous 2 years. The pattern that emerged showed a man who felt forgotten and disrespected rather than someone who was primarily concerned with financial compensation. She leaned forward, her voice becoming more serious. The crucial insight was recognizing that his actions were about dignity, not money. Once we understood that, finding a solution became much easier. Morrison had been quiet during this discussion, but now he spoke up with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than challenge. General Martinez, I have to admit that this approach is quite different from what I was taught about dealing with hostile forces. How do you maintain the respect of your Marines when you're focusing on understanding and negotiation rather than immediate force? It was a fair question that got to the heart of military culture and expectations about leadership. Sarah considered her response carefully before speaking. Colonel, that's an important question, and I think it reflects a common misunderstanding about what this approach actually involves. She stood up and moved closer to Morrison, speaking directly to him. My Marines don't see understanding the enemy as weakness. They see it as smart tactics. When we achieve mission success with minimal casualties, they understand that thorough planning and strategic thinking saved lives. Sarah's voice became more emphatic as she continued. The Marines under my command have never questioned my willingness to use force when necessary. They've seen me make the hard decisions when diplomacy wasn't possible. But they've also seen that I don't use force unnecessarily, and they respect that. She gestured toward the projection screen, which still showed the timeline of the government building incident. In situations like the protest I just described, my Marines were fully prepared to use force if negotiations failed. They had contingency plans for every possible scenario, but they also understood that achieving the same result without violence was a better outcome for everyone involved. Morrison nodded slowly, processing this perspective. I think I'm beginning to understand, he said. You're not choosing between force and diplomacy. You're choosing the most effective approach for each specific situation. Exactly, Sarah replied, pleased that Morrison was grasping the concept. Military force is a tool, not a goal. The goal is always mission accomplishment with minimum necessary casualties. She returned to her position behind the witness table. My Marines trust me because I've proven that I can make good decisions under pressure, whether those decisions involve negotiation, tactical planning, or direct combat. They know that I'll use whatever approach gives us the best chance of success while bringing everyone home safely. Admiral Chin had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest. General Martinez, how do you train junior officers to develop this kind of tactical flexibility? Sarah's expression brightened at the opportunity to discuss training and development. Admiral, that's one of the most important aspects of leadership development, she replied. We need to teach our officers to think strategically about every situation, not just to apply standard tactical solutions. She moved to the front of the room, addressing the entire panel. We've developed training scenarios that require officers to consider multiple approaches to the same problem. They have to analyze the tactical situation, understand the motivations of all parties involved, and develop plans that achieve mission objectives with minimum casualties. Sarah gestured toward the officers as she spoke. Most importantly, we teach them that asking questions and gathering information isn't a sign of weakness or indecision. It's a sign of thorough professional preparation. Admiral Chin set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face carefully. The room had been transformed over the past several hours. What had begun as a routine briefing had evolved into something much more significant. A fundamental discussion about the nature of military leadership in the modern world. General Martinez, Admiral Chun said slowly, I have one more question, but it's somewhat personal in nature. You've shared some remarkable insights about combat leadership and tactical innovation, but I'm curious about the personal cost of carrying these responsibilities. How do you maintain your emotional and psychological well-being while making the kinds of decisions you described? The question caught Sarah off guard. In all her years of military service, very few senior officers had ever asked about the personal impact of command responsibilities. It was a topic that was rarely discussed openly in military circles, despite its obvious importance. Sarah walked to the window again, looking out at the naval base where hundreds of service members were going about their daily duties. Many of them were young, barely out of their teens, and they trusted their leaders to make decisions that would keep them safe while accomplishing their missions. Admiral, she said quietly, that may be the most important question anyone has asked me today. She turned back to face the panel, and for the first time since the meeting began, her professional composure showed signs of vulnerability. The honest answer is that it's the hardest part of command. Making decisions that determine who lives and who dies is something that changes you. It has to change you because if it doesn't, then you're not fully understanding the weight of what you're doing. Sarah returned to her seat, but instead of her usual erect military posture, she leaned forward with her elbows on the table. Every Marine who has died under my command is someone I think about daily. Corporal Walsh and Sergeant Chun from the Operation Mountain Shield mission I described earlier. I know their families. I attended their funerals. I looked their parents in the eye and tried to explain why their children had to die. The room was completely silent. This level of personal revelation was unprecedented in the formal setting of a military briefing. After every deployment, I spend weeks second-guessing every decision I made. I replay scenarios in my mind, wondering if there was something else I could have done, some different approach that might have saved lives. Sarah's voice became quieter, more introspective. The Operation Silver Dawn mission I mentioned, the one where our intelligence was wrong. I still wake up sometimes thinking about those two civilians who were injured. They were a grandmother and her 12-year-old granddaughter. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they got hurt because I didn't verify our intelligence thoroughly enough. General Williams leaned forward with obvious concern. General Martinez, have you received counseling support to help you process these experiences? Sarah nodded. I have, General Williams. The Marine Corps has significantly improved its support services for officers dealing with the psychological impacts of combat command. But honestly, I think some degree of psychological burden is appropriate and necessary. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer. If making life and death decisions doesn't affect you emotionally, then something is wrong. The weight of these decisions should be felt. It keeps you honest, keeps you careful, and ensures that you never become casual about the use of force. Morrison had been listening intently, and his expression showed genuine concern rather than his earlier skepticism. General Martinez, he said, how do you balance that emotional weight with the need to remain decisive and confident for your Marines? It was a thoughtful question that showed Morrison's growing understanding of the complexities of combat leadership. Colonel Morrison, that's the central challenge of command, Sarah replied. Your Marines need to see confidence and decisiveness, but you also need to maintain your humanity and moral compass. She stood up and began pacing again, the movement helping her organize her thoughts. I've learned to compartmentalize to some degree. During operations, I focus completely on the tactical situation and the immediate needs of my Marines. The emotional processing happens later, when there's time and space for reflection. Sarah stopped pacing and faced the panel directly. But I also think it's important for Marines to see that their commanders are human beings who take these responsibilities seriously. They don't need to see me breaking down under pressure, but they do need to know that I understand the gravity of what we're doing. Admiral Chan was taking notes again, clearly finding value in this perspective on leadership psychology. General Martinez, he said, you've mentioned the importance of reflection and emotional processing. Can you share some specific practices that have helped you maintain your effectiveness over multiple deployments? Sarah returned to her seat, considering how much personal detail to share in this formal setting. Admiral, I've developed several practices that help me process these experiences constructively, she said. First, as I mentioned earlier, I write detailed personal reflections after every significant operation. These aren't just tactical analysis. They include my emotional responses, my concerns about decisions made, and lessons learned for future situations. She paused, organizing her thoughts. Second, I maintain relationships with other combat commanders who understand these challenges. Having people you can talk to honestly about the realities of command is crucial for psychological health. Sarah's voice became more animated as she discussed this support network. Third, I make it a point to stay connected with the families of Marines who have served under my command. This isn't just about visiting families of the fallen. It's about maintaining relationships with Marines who have successfully completed their service and moved on to civilian life. Morrison looked curious. How does staying connected with former Marines help with the psychological challenges of command? Sarah smiled slightly. Colonel, it helps me remember why we do this job. When I see former Marines who are successful in civilian life, who are raising families and contributing to their communities, it reminds me that the sacrifices we make in military service have lasting positive impacts. She gestured toward the window overlooking the naval base. It's easy to become focused on the negative aspects, the casualties, the failures, the moral ambiguity of combat decisions. Staying connected with success stories helps maintain perspective and reminds me that our service matters. General Williams had been listening with obvious interest. General Martinez, do you think the military does enough to prepare officers for the psychological challenges of combat command? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. General Williams, I think we've made significant improvements in recent years, but there's still room for growth, she said. We do a good job of preparing officers for the tactical and technical aspects of command, but we could do more to prepare them for the emotional and psychological realities. She stood up and moved to the front of the room. I think we need to include more discussion of moral decision-making in our leadership training. We need to help young officers understand that moral ambiguity is a normal part of combat operations, and that struggling with difficult decisions is a sign of good judgment, not weakness. Sarah's voice became more emphatic as she continued. We also need to normalize the idea that seeking psychological support is a professional responsibility, not a personal failure. Combat commanders have a duty to maintain their mental health, just like they have a duty to maintain their physical fitness. Admiral Chun looked up from his notes. Are there specific changes you would recommend to current training programs? Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely, Admiral. I would recommend including case studies that focus on moral decision-making under pressure. Young officers need to wrestle with scenarios where there are no clear right answers, where every option involves significant costs. She moved back to the projection screen and brought up a new slide showing a training curriculum outline. We should also include more emphasis on emotional intelligence and interpersonal communication skills. Understanding and working with people, both your own Marines and potential enemies, is crucial for modern military operations. Sarah pointed to specific elements of the training outline. Most importantly, we need to teach officers that admitting uncertainty or asking for advice is a sign of professional competence, not weakness. The best commanders I've served with were always willing to say, "I don't know," when they didn't have complete information. Morrison was studying the training outline with clear interest. General Martinez, these recommendations seem to emphasize collaborative leadership rather than authoritarian command. How do you maintain discipline and quick decision-making with this approach? It was another thoughtful question from Morrison, showing how much his understanding had evolved during the course of the meeting. Colonel Morrison, that's an excellent question, Sarah replied. Collaborative leadership and military discipline aren't mutually exclusive. In fact, I would argue that they're complementary. She disconnected her phone from the projection system and faced Morrison directly. When Marines understand the reasoning behind decisions, when they feel that their input is valued, and when they trust their commander's judgment, they're more likely to execute orders effectively, not less likely. Sarah's voice became more passionate as she explained her philosophy. Authoritarian command works when you're dealing with simple, routine situations where there's a clear right answer. But modern military operations are complex, dynamic, and morally ambiguous. In those situations, you need Marines who can think creatively and adapt to changing circumstances. She gestured toward the panel of officers. That kind of adaptive thinking only happens when Marines feel empowered to contribute ideas and when they understand the broader context of their missions. Admiral Chun was nodding with apparent approval. General Martinez, can you give us a specific example of how collaborative leadership improved operational effectiveness? Sarah returned to her seat, clearly energized by the opportunity to discuss this aspect of leadership. Admiral, during our recent operation in Eastern Europe, we were tasked with establishing a secure corridor for humanitarian aid convoys. The standard approach would have been to establish checkpoints and patrol routes based on our tactical analysis. She leaned forward, her enthusiasm evident. Instead, I asked my squad leaders and senior NCOs to spend time with the local population, gathering information about travel patterns, security concerns, and cultural sensitivities. The plan we developed based on their input was completely different from our original approach. Sarah's voice became more animated as she described the operation. Instead of imposing our security measures on the local population, we worked with community leaders to develop a system that met both our security needs and their practical requirements. The result was a 40% reduction in security incidents and 100% successful delivery of humanitarian supplies. Morrison was taking detailed notes now, clearly impressed with the results. What made the difference? He asked. The key insight came from Lance Corporal Rodriguez, who had been talking with local truck drivers, Sarah replied. He learned that our proposed route would force drivers to travel through an area controlled by a rival ethnic group, which would make them targets for harassment or worse. She gestured enthusiastically as she continued. Rodriguez's information allowed us to adjust our route and coordinate with both ethnic communities to ensure safe passage. This was information that wouldn't have been available through traditional intelligence gathering, It required building personal relationships with local people. Sarah paused, letting the implications sink in. If I had simply imposed a top-down command structure, Rodriguez might never have shared that information. But because he knew his input was valued, he brought it forward, and it made all the difference in the operation's success. General Williams was clearly impressed. That's a powerful example of how frontline Marines can contribute to strategic success. Sarah nodded. General Williams, I've learned that the most effective military units are those where information flows freely in both directions. Commanders need to share the strategic context with their Marines, and Marines need to feel comfortable sharing tactical insights with their commanders. She stood up and moved closer to the panel. This doesn't mean abandoning military hierarchy or discipline. It means using that hierarchy to facilitate effective communication and decision-making rather than just enforcing obedience. Admiral Chun had been listening to this discussion with obvious interest, and now he leaned forward with a more serious expression. General Martinez, he said, everything you've shared today has been impressive and thought-provoking. But I have one final question that gets to the heart of why we requested this briefing. The room became more tense, sensing that Admiral Chun was about to address the real purpose of the meeting. We're facing increasing pressure from political leaders and the media to demonstrate quick, decisive victories in our overseas operations. There's a perception that the military has become too cautious, too focused on avoiding casualties, and not aggressive enough in pursuing our objectives. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had suspected this meeting was about more than just operational effectiveness. The approach you've described, emphasizing understanding the enemy, seeking nonviolent solutions, and minimizing casualties, is impressive from a humanitarian standpoint, Admiral Chin continued. But some people are concerned that it might not be aggressive enough for the current strategic environment. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that everything she had shared, all her examples of successful operations, her philosophy of combat leadership, her emphasis on minimizing casualties, was being weighed against political pressure for more aggressive military action. Admiral, she said carefully, what specific concerns do you have about the effectiveness of my approach? Admiral Chin shuffled through his papers, clearly choosing his words carefully. General Martinez, your operational results speak for themselves. You've achieved mission success with remarkably low casualty rates. But we're receiving pressure to demonstrate that the military can achieve faster results with more decisive action. Sarah felt a familiar frustration rising. She had spent the entire meeting explaining how strategic thinking and careful planning led to better results, and now she was being told that political considerations might outweigh operational effectiveness. Admiral, she said, her voice taking on a harder edge, are you suggesting that we should prioritize the appearance of decisive action over actual mission effectiveness? It was a direct challenge to the Admiral's authority, but Sarah felt that the principles she had been discussing were too important to compromise. Admiral Chen paused, clearly recognizing the significance of the question. General Martinez, he said slowly, I'm asking whether your approach can be adapted to meet the political realities we're facing, while still maintaining its operational effectiveness. Sarah stood up, her military bearing evident in every movement. Admiral, with respect, I think that question fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between political considerations and military effectiveness. She moved to the front of the room, facing the entire panel with complete confidence. Political pressure for quick results is exactly what leads to operational failures, increased casualties, and strategic setbacks. Every military disaster in recent history has involved political leaders pushing for faster action than tactical situations warranted. Her voice became more emphatic as she continued. If we allow political considerations to override tactical judgment, we're not serving our country, we're serving politicians. And that's a betrayal of every Marine who trusts us to make smart decisions under fire. The room was completely silent. Sarah had just challenged not only Admiral Chen's question, but the entire premise of political influence on military operations. The silence that followed Sarah's statement was deafening. Every officer in the room understood that she had just crossed a line that few military leaders were willing to cross, directly challenging the influence of political considerations on military decision-making. Admiral Chin's expression was unreadable as he studied Sarah's face. Colonel Morrison had stopped taking notes and was staring at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. General Williams was leaning back in her chair, clearly processing the implications of what had just been said. Sarah remained standing at the front of the room, her hands clasped behind her back in a perfect military stance. She had spent her entire career being careful, being diplomatic, saying the right things to the right people. But something about this moment, this question, this challenge to everything she believed about military service had pushed her beyond the point of careful diplomacy. General Martinez, Admiral Chun said slowly, "That's a very strong statement. Are you suggesting that military commanders should ignore political guidance entirely?" Sarah looked directly at the Admiral, her resolve unwavering. "No, Admiral. I'm suggesting that military commanders should provide honest assessments about what can be achieved, how long it will take, and what it will cost. And then we should resist political pressure to promise results that we can't deliver or to take shortcuts that will increase casualties." She moved closer to the panel, her voice becoming more passionate. Politicians make promises based on what they think voters want to hear. Military commanders make plans based on tactical reality. Those two things are often incompatible, and when they are, we have a professional obligation to tell the truth about what's actually possible. Morrison leaned forward, clearly engaged despite the potential career implications of this discussion. "General Martinez, but surely you understand that military operations don't happen in a political vacuum. We have to consider public support, congressional funding, international relations." Sarah turned to face Morrison directly. "Colonel Morrison, of course military operations have political dimensions. But the question is whether political considerations should influence tactical decisions. And my answer is absolutely not." She gestured toward the projection screen, which still showed tactical diagrams from her earlier presentations. "Every example I've shared today, every successful operation, every saved life, every mission accomplished with minimal casualties, happened because we made decisions based on tactical reality rather than political convenience." Sarah's voice became more intense as she continued. "The moment you start making tactical decisions based on what looks good in the media or what politicians want to hear, you start getting Marines killed unnecessarily. And that's something I will never do." Admiral Chun was taking notes again, but his expression remained serious and somewhat concerned. "General Martinez," he said, "I appreciate your passion and your commitment to your Marines. But the reality is that military operations are funded by Congress, approved by civilian leadership, and conducted under public scrutiny. We can't simply ignore those realities." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the validity of his point. "Admiral, you're absolutely right that we operate within a civilian command structure, and I would never suggest otherwise. But there's a difference between following civilian guidance and allowing civilian politics to override military judgment." She moved back to the witness table, but remained standing. "When civilian leaders ask us what's possible, we should tell them the truth. When they ask how long something will take, we should give them honest estimates. When they ask about